Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Oh, a game of cat and wolf. Part 6 of the Wolfman Series. Oh, Cat held the note in her hands and read it again. "I'm coming for you next." It sent shivers down her spine. Who was this person that broke into her art gallery and stole her most favorite painting she'd ever created? Her half-man, half-wolf protector of her childhood dreams. And now he threatened her? Well, the deputies were dusting for fingerprints when she showed the note to the sheriff. "Catherine, I don't want you going anywhere without an escort till we find who did this. Keep your doors locked and don't go anywhere alone. I'll have one of my deputies posted in front of your house tonight. Is there anyone you can tell to come stay with you for a while?" Cat wished her brother was here right now. How did Jack know she was in danger? His phone message said he was returning from Germany early and to be careful, that she was in some kind of danger. Her brother and she had always been so close they could read each other's thoughts, but she certainly never would have taken him for a psychic. She smiled at the thought. Well, she was angry. Our first month in business had been tremendous. The community of Telluride had been so welcoming, and she'd sold several paintings already. The artists who commissioned their paintings to be sold in her gallery were easy to deal with. No one questioned her prices, and she felt like she fit into this community from the very beginning. Everything was going so well, and then this had to happen. Now she had a huge pane of glass to replace, broken glass everywhere, and her favorite painting was gone. She told the sheriff about the guy who'd been in the store inquiring about the painting, and that when she told him it wasn't for sale, well, he got very belligerent and made a scene in front of the other customers. She had no doubt it was he who broke into the gallery. She had a good description of him and would verify it with her customers, the ones that were in the store that day. Well, a husband of one of the artists in town brought over a large piece of plywood to board up the broken window until it could be replaced. They helped her vacuum up the broken glass and asked if she'd like to stay with them up in the mountain village for a few days. The sheriff piped in and told Cat that'd be a very good idea. Well, Cat agreed to stay with them till her brother got back in town the next day or two. She knew he was flying in from Germany, but he'd have to catch connecting flights from New York, Colorado, and that could be dicey this time of year. Snow was already falling in many states. Catherine was particularly disappointed that her installation for Halloween might get delayed. She'd planned a theme of werewolves and witches and had scheduled several artists to start hanging paintings next week. She left the gallery with her friends, and they picked up a cup of coffee and walked to the gondola that takes passengers to and from Mountain Village. The little town of Telluride it's nestled in a box canyon surrounded by the majestic peaks of the San Juans. The town itself is just 8 blocks wide and 12 blocks long, but Mountain Village is perched above the valley floor at 9,500 feet, and there's a free gondola that operates daily between the two towns. Even with all the tourists that frequent the area, it still has small town appeal, and Cat felt very safe here till today. Now her eyes darted over every group of tourists and each person walking past for the face that she remembered. The face of the man who had stolen her painting and threatened her. She tried again to reach Jack on the phone, but had to leave another message. "Jack, I'm okay. My gallery got broken into and some creep stole my favorite painting. You know, the one you were looking at of the werewolf? I think it was the same guy who wanted to buy it and got so obnoxious with me when I wouldn't sell it to him. Anyway, I'm staying at Sam and Stacy's for the night. Let me know when you reach Salt Lake. Love you." Well, Jack was flying into New York. From there, he'd get a connecting flight to Boston and then Salt Lake City. It was normally about the same time and distance to travel from Denver to Telluride as it was from Salt Lake, but I-70 was washed out in the canyon near Glenwood Springs, So even though it had snowed in Moab and was probably snowing in Telluride right now, it would still be the fastest way. He felt an urgency to get to Kat. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was in grave danger. As soon as the plane landed, Jack's phone began buzzing with messages from Kat. He quickly called her. Kat told him about the break-in and described the fellow that she thought had done it. The description was vague. Tall, muscular, strong jaw and cheekbones visible behind his facial hair, penetrating eyes that were deep blue. Kat, that could be just about anybody. Are you sure there wasn't anything unique that would give us something more to go by? Jack wanted to know. Well, there was one thing. He was wearing something around his neck. A leather thong with a carved amulet. It was striking. It caught my eye immediately when he walked up to me. When he saw me looking at it, he tucked it into his shirt and buttoned another button so it would be hidden. He had a very hairy chest, dark, curly hair. He was rugged and handsome. If he wasn't so darn rude, I probably would have been attracted to him, Kat chuckled. Well, Jack told her to stay at her friend's house and repeated what the sheriff had told her about not going anywhere alone. He'd get there as quickly as he possibly could. Now, Jack thought about the amulet he was wearing. He knew exactly what the guy who was stalking Kat was. He was a werewolf, most likely from the same region he had just been in where the old gypsy woman had given him the amulet to wear. The amulet was supposed to be worn to keep the werewolf at bay, to be able to walk among men, the old gypsy had said. But there were still so many unanswered questions. Why was he after Kat? What did the old gypsy meant when she said Kat was the new queen of the gypsies? And why did Jack's parents never tell them the truth about Catherine's birth parents? And who gave Jack the photos? And why did the woman in the photograph look just like Kat? Jack's head was spinning with all the unanswered pieces of the puzzle. Okay, first things first, I've got to make sure Kat's all right. He had just enough time to grab a cup of coffee before his connecting flight. Stacy and Sam had fixed up their guest room for Kat. She was grateful for their hospitality and enjoyed getting to know them a little better. They had an enormous Great Dane dog named Gus that followed Kat all around and put his giant head in her lap every time she sat down. Well, Sam was a general contractor and was needed back at a job site, so he said goodbye to the women and he left. It was a pleasant afternoon, and talking about art and good hiking locations and general girl talk. At 2 p.m, Stacy needed to pick up her daughter from school. She didn't want to leave Kat alone, but Kat assured her she'd be just fine, especially with Gus to watch over her. Stacy told her to stay in the house no matter what, and she'd be back in a half hour or so. They didn't want Kat going back to her house till her brother was there, so Stacy said she'd stop by the store to pick up a few necessities that would get Kat by for a couple of days. Well, it felt a little uncomfortable, everybody looking out for her like this. Kat prided herself on being a strong, independent woman. She was able to take care of herself, with a little help from her brother every now and then. Kat and Jack's parents, they died in a car accident when Kat was away at college. And it was still hard on her to accept that they were gone. But at least she had her brother, and nonetheless, she'd never felt as vulnerable as she did right now. She looked over the books in Stacy's bookshelf and found one called The Witching Hour by Anne Rice. It looked promising. She made a cup of tea and curled up in the comfy oversized chair by the window and began the book. No more than 10 pages in, she heard a low growl from Gus. "Hush, boy, it's okay," Kat reassured him. He settled for a few minutes, then perked his ears up and growled again. Kat got up, made sure the doors were locked, and settled back down into her chair. A loud, sharp bark from Gus just about made Kat jump right out of her skin. "Gus!" she yelled. The dog sprang from its resting place beside her chair and bolted for the door, barking loudly. Kat's heart was beating wildly in her chest, but she stayed in her chair, not about to move. The heavy wood door burst open, splintering into pieces, and a giant beast leaped in on top of the barking dog. Kat jumped from her chair and ran to the bedroom, slamming and locking the door behind her. She heard Gus and the beast fighting in the hallway, then heard a whimper and no more barking. She looked around the room for a weapon, anything she could grab to try to defend herself. She managed to get the window open and pushed the screen out and jumped. Halfway down the long driveway, she felt her feet go out from under her. The beast had caught her and threw her over his shoulder. She fought with all the strength she could muster, but he held her tight and ran into the surrounding forest. Houses were scattered all throughout the trees, and Kat screamed at the top of her lungs. She didn't feel the blow to her head. Hours, or maybe it was days later, Kat didn't know, she found herself tied up at the back of what looked like a small cave. She had no idea where she was. She was alone, that much she knew, and she was alive. There was a blanket around her, old and dirty. She was still fully clothed, and it didn't look like her clothes were ripped, so she knew the beast hadn't hurt her. She thought back to the moment when he had grabbed her. He looked familiar. He looked like her painting, half man and half wolf. She didn't think werewolves were real. Hers were merely fantasy, brought on by her feverish dreams when she was sick as a child. Even while she was in the Netherlands attending art school, she had fantasized about the creatures. They were common appearances in her artwork, but that didn't mean she really believed they existed. And to think she had sent her brother on a wild goose chase to find out more about the legend. That was research, she told herself, not because she thought they were real. So what was that creature that had grabbed her, and what did he want with her? She was so thirsty. Her head hurt, and she was scared. She knew that Stacy would be terrified to come home and find her front door splintered, her dog lying there, probably dead, Kat gone. She knew the sheriff would be looking for her, and her brother would be too. Was he here already? She tried to send him a mental image. They had communicated that way since they were young. It had been a game to him. She would try to think very, very hard and see if her brother could pick up her thoughts. He would do the same. Well, it rarely worked, but as they both became teenagers, they seemed to know what the other was doing, even when they tried to hide it from each other. And as they became adults, they often had moments when it seemed they could read each other's thoughts. Kat would think of Jack, and right then he would call her, or he would be coming to visit her, unannounced, and she would feel him coming near. Once during a hiking trip, it had just started to snow. Well, the trail quickly became covered, and Kat couldn't see it any longer. She became disoriented and lost. Panic started to set in. Then out of the woods, her brother appeared. He had gone looking for her when the snow started, and he found her. He was always there, just when she needed him. And she needed him now. There was a small shaft of light shining in from above her, enough for her to see the wood scaffolding inside her small cave, and she realized then that she was actually in a mine shaft. That made sense. There were small mines all around Telluride. She heard a movement outside, and she looked up to see a shadow crossing the little bit of light. The man looked in through the opening and, seeing that she was now awake, jumped down and crouched beside her. Kat screamed, and he shook his head and said, "Shh. No one will hear you out here. I'm not going to hurt you." The man looked like Kat remembered him from her encounter the other day, only he seemed bigger, more burly and hairy. "Why am I here?" Kat demanded. "I didn't mean to scare you," the man replied. Kat was angry. "Untie me now," she screamed at him. "I can't," he told her. "I've been searching for you your whole life. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to talk to you." Immediately, Kat's thoughts jumped to all kinds of perversions. Was this some kind of sick serial killer? If you just wanted to talk to me, you could have just done so in the gallery. You didn't have to kidnap me and tie me up. He smiled, showing his sharp fangs. "But it's so much more fun this way, Catherine. Besides, I wasn't really sure it was really you until I saw the paintings in your gallery. The one I asked to purchase from you, when you told me it wasn't for sale, I knew without a doubt that I'd found you." His dark eyes narrowed, and Kat caught a gleam of golden yellow showing through. "You're a wolf, aren't you? A werewolf? I didn't know they were real." He replied, "There's a lot you don't know, Catherine, and this is just the start of it. My name is Julian, and I am your father." Jack landed in Salt Lake and tried to phone his sister, but a worried Stacy answered her phone. "Jack, this is Stacy. Kat's gone. Someone smashed my front door and took her. I was picking up my daughter from school, and Kat was only alone for less than an hour. Her phone is here, her wallet, everything. Jack, I'm so sorry. I'm so worried." Jack ran through the airport to the car rental kiosk, dialing the sheriff's department as he ran. The 6.5-hour drive took Jack less than 5 hours. He knew he was driving recklessly, but it didn't matter to him. The only thing that mattered was Catherine. He wasn't sure what he'd do now once he got there, how he would find her. He didn't even know if she was still in the area. Hell, he didn't even know if she was still alive. He believed she was. He thought he could sense her calling to him for help. He arrived in Telluride just as the sun was beginning to set over the mountains. He drove up to Kat's house. He had his own key and let himself in. He could tell that the sheriff had been there. His card was on the kitchen table. He picked it up and he put it in his pocket. The sheriff had a good description of the man and suspect, but they didn't know he was a wolf. Jack, on the other hand, knew to look for clues that the sheriff would not have. Scent, for example. Kat's house smelled like a wet dog had been in there, and she didn't have any pets. He walked around the house, sniffing every room. He could tell how recent that wolf had been in there. He walked outside, following the scent. It was dusk, and it was cold. Jack had on a thick parka and went back inside for a ski hat and ski gloves. Jack was rarely without his cowboy hat, and he felt strange putting on the snow gear. At the last minute, he grabbed a backpack with some food and some water. He didn't know where he was going or how long he'd be out. But wolves like to hunt at night, and he was hunting a wolf. For the next hour, Kat listened to her captor's stories. It was an engrossing tale of gypsies and werewolves and witchcraft in a village in Germany. He told her how he'd met her mother when he was a very young man and fell in love with her beauty. "She was married to Gunther, but I took her anyway. You are the result of our mating." She fled Germany, afraid that Gunther would find out, and found her sister living in Montana. She gave you to her sister to protect you. When I discovered she was gone, I flew into a rage and went after Gunther. We fought. I would have killed him, but he got away. I did manage to bite him, though. Gunther found your mother in the United States and tried to force her to return with him to Germany, but she resisted. She wanted to be near you to watch you grow, even though she could never let Gunther know the truth. My mother, your grandmother, is the queen of gypsies. You come from a long line of Volkolak, gypsy royalty. You, Catherine, are the next in line. You are the new queen. It is in your blood. It's your birthright. Kat was covered in a thick fur blanket, but she was still cold. She didn't believe a word he said. She assumed he had been stalking for quite some time, long enough to know where she had grown up and who her parents were and to concoct this crazy story. There was a slightly perceptible sound outside, and Julian's ears perked, and he rapidly moved to the entrance of the mine shaft. In the next instant, he was gone. Kat laid back on her mattress. She was still tied up. He had refused to untie her no matter how many times she asked. She kept trying to send thoughts to Jack. "Help me." She knew he was looking for her. She could feel him. Her thoughts wandered back to when they were kids. He was always so protective. She remembered her neighbors bringing over sweet rolls. Was that Hannah? Well, Jack would always make sure Kat had one first. She thought about her parents. Her dad, who was a hard-working cattle rancher. Her mom was the town beauty. Kat smiled to herself. Her dad adored her mom. He liked to tell stories about how he had wooed her away from all the other guys with his sparkling personality and his wit. Her mom would laugh and tell him it was the tight jeans and cowboy hat that did it. "I never thought I'd love a man that smelled like horse crap till I met your dad." She'd smile, that beautiful dimple in her chin, and Dad would blush. She sure missed them. She and Jack had grown up doing the things that ranch kids do. They raised chickens and had a milk cow, and they both had horses and lots of chores. After they'd lost their parents in the car accident, Jack took on all the responsibilities of maintaining the ranch while Kat finished art school. She'd wanted to return to the ranch, but it was just too remote for her. She thought about opening a gallery in Jackson Hole, but she'd always loved Colorado. She thought back on their yearly ski trips to Telluride. That was what had made her decide to make Telluride her home. Until now, she had such fond memories of good times spent here in these mountains. Now she was being held hostage in a mine shaft somewhere in the San Juans, with a crazy lunatic who claims he's her father. She didn't know where she was or how Jack would find her. While Kat was reminiscing, Jack was following a scent. His senses were as sharp as a bloodhound, and he felt as if the wolf was making it very clear where he wanted him to go. Up to the old Tomboy mine. He knew that Kat had disappeared from Mountain Village, which was just a gondola ride up the mountain from the lower town of Telluride. But that scent didn't lead him there. No, this scent was leading him away from town and into forest in the opposite direction. Jack had no doubt that whoever had taken Kat knew exactly what he was doing. He knew Jack would be on his trail, and he was leading him right where he wanted him to be. Even in the snow, the scent was strong. Occasionally, fallen logs and brush would be in the way, and the scent would be so strong on the other side that there was no way Jack could miss it. It was as if he rubbed his scent on trees specifically so the trail could easily be followed. The trail up to Tomboy was steep and covered with freshly fallen snow. In the daylight, the aspen would be brilliant shades of red, orange, and yellow, but at night, it all looked dark. The moon had not yet risen, and the path was difficult to follow. If it hadn't been for Jack's strong sense of smell, he wouldn't have been able to follow this trail at night. Well, towards the last bend, just before reaching the old mining settlement of Tomboy, the scent veered sharply east. The moon was just starting to rise over Chicago Peak, part of the Sneffels Range, at a height just under 14,000 feet. Jack heard a wolf howl and knew he was close. He could feel that Kat was nearby and figured she must be in one of the mine shafts that littered this area. He reached up and removed the amulet from his neck, placing it in the pocket of his parka. He wanted to make sure he would find this beast straight on, wolf to wolf. Kat lay shivering under the big blanket. She had dozed on and off, but she was awake now, and she was listening for sounds in the dark. Every twig that snapped, every rustle of leaves caught her attention. The moon had just begun to shed light into the cave, enough to see that there was a bowl of water near where she lay, and if she stretched her neck far enough, she could reach the water. She was so thirsty. Her hands were still tied behind her back, her ankles were tightly tethered, but she could maneuver onto her elbows and reach the bowl of water. Pulling the blanket back over herself with her teeth, she fell back onto the thin camping mattress on the floor. She wondered again why this man had taken her if he didn't mean to kill her, and to tell her that crazy story. None of this made any sense. Was this all just a game to him? A game of cat and wolf? Outside the cave, she heard the soft crunching of frozen snow and a wolf's howl. Jack ran in the direction of the howl. He knew he was being led into a trap, but Kat's life was at stake and his own personal safety didn't matter any longer. He came to a rocky outcropping where the moon shone down on the full figure of the wolf. His huge head rose skyward, and he let out an unearthly howl. He turned and faced Jack. Jack felt the transformation throughout his entire body. His neck jerked, his fingers and knuckles elongated, and razor-sharp claws cut through the ends of his leather gloves. The parka strained against his burgeoning chest. A fierce growl escaped from his lips. The air was thick with tension as the two werewolves faced off. The battle began with a blur of fur and claws as they clashed with incredible strength and speed. Jack lunged at his foe with lightning-quick strikes, his fur shimmering in the moonlight. He knew Kat lay bound and helpless nearby. He could sense her presence. The moon was straight above the walls of the shaft now, and Kat needed to get closer to the opening. She rolled over. She managed to get to her knees, and then with elbows for balance, she managed to stand. She tried to hop forward, the ray of light that shone through the narrow opening. She yelled out, "Jack!" As the battle raged on, hearing cat cry out his name infused Jack with a strength he did not know he possessed. With a mighty roar, he landed a decisive blow on the jaw of the other werewolf, sending him crashing to the ground. He leaped on top of him and held him pinned to the ground. He lifted his mighty head and let out a terrific howl before ripping open the neck of the beast. He didn't have a chance to ask him who he was, why he was here, or why he wanted his sister. Breathing heavily, Jack ran towards the mine shaft and leapt inside. Catherine gasped as Jack began the transformation back into a man. He broke her restraints with trembling hands and she threw her arms around her brother. There was a mix of tears and relief. The bond of sister and brother grew stronger than any curse. Through her tears, Kat held Jack's head in her hands. "You've got a lot of explaining to do," she said. The next several days were just a whirlwind of activity. Jack had to explain to the sheriff how he had found his sister. And there was an investigation to find out who the man was that had taken her and what his intentions had been. The sheriff wanted to know how the man and Jack had gotten so badly injured. There was no known wolves around Telluride, and no dog or coyote would have done this kind of damage. Jack blamed it on a mountain lion. He said he'd been looking for his sister around the old abandoned mine shafts at Tomboy and Smuggler Mines when he came upon a mountain lion attacking the man who Kat had described to him earlier, the man who had come into her gallery a day before the break-in. It all sounded feasible to the sheriff, and he let it go. Jack and Sam fixed the window at the gallery. One of the deputies had located the hotel where the stranger had originally booked a room. It was determined that he was Julian Codona from Germany. They found Kat's stolen painting inside, and it was returned to her unharmed. Stacy and Sam's dog was recovering from his wounds, and Kat paid them a visit to thank them for helping her and brought the dog a big basket of dog treats. And Jack even promised to tell Kat everything. It was Saturday night, a week before Halloween. Kat had been back home for a week. She had her gallery back, and it was up and running, and her new installation of paintings would be ready within a week. Everything was back on schedule. She poured Jack a whiskey and herself a glass of wine and sat down next to him on the sofa. "It's time," she said, and gave him a look that meant, "I won't take no for an answer." Jack, he took a deep breath and he began his story. "Okay, Kat. A few years ago, back in Montana, a bunch of us guys were hunting a wolf." It was past midnight by the time Jack finished his story. He told his sister about hunting Gunther and Hanna Yeager. He told her about hunting down Hans Yeager in Washington. He explained how he had been bitten and how the transformation had been passed from Hans to himself. He told her about Doc Morris and Parker. Then he proceeded to tell her about Germany and all the mysterious coincidences that occurred there. The one thing he left out of his story was the truth about her parents. He just wasn't ready to accept that, and he didn't know how she would react. They had been as close as two siblings could be throughout their entire life. He wasn't ready to tell her that she wasn't really his sister. There were still too many pieces of the puzzle that were missing. Until he could source out the answers, he felt it better to keep those missing pieces to himself. As he reached down to kiss the top of his sister's head, she said, "Jack, are my real parents Julian Cadana and Hannah Yeager?" It was going to be a long night. Part 7. The Wolf's Amulet. Well, Julian lay in a small hospital bed, handcuffed and hooked up to feeding tubes. He'd been unconscious since arriving and woke to find himself surrounded by blinking lights and the smell of antiseptic, and he struggled against his restraints. A uniformed officer peered in from where he stood guard outside the door. "Well, you're awake," the officer said, and immediately radioed the office. An attending nurse rushed into the room and adjusted his tubes. She told Julian that his throat had been ripped open and had numerous abrasions. He'd lost a lot of blood, and he came in by ambulance, unconscious and just barely alive. They had transported him from Telluride to Montrose Memorial Hospital. The nurse didn't say anything about his bound wrist and legs, but Julian assumed that they were waiting to see if he lived before taking him on to jail. He wasn't about to let that happen. He hadn't expected that Jack would get the best of him. He knew Jack would be coming to help Catherine, and he thought he could easily overtake him. Then with Jack out of the way, he could force Catherine to come to Germany with him. He could force her to stay and help him lead the people. Julian Cadona had been born with gypsy blood, but he bore the mark of the wolf. His bloodline was strong. He was Volkalok, from a long line of gypsy werewolves, but he bore another burden almost as difficult. He was the king of his band of gypsies. Although unrecognized outside of their own little community, the title brought tremendous responsibilities within a family. Leadership passed through family lines unless there was no successor. In that case, someone would be chosen from within. In the Romani culture, a community had a leader known as a baro, also known as king, or the top person in the gypsy community. Romani gypsies do not hold court with English customs of kings and queens and royalty, but the title held enormous responsibility all the same. He was responsible for making the decisions for his community and keeping their way of life hidden and sacred. Well, during the war, most of the European Roma gypsy communities had been destroyed. His little village, hidden in the forest outside of Thale, survived only because of their ability to turn themselves into wolves. But even so, many of the people were captured and killed, or worse. The few that remained outsmarted the soldiers, killing as many as they could. But the Romani people had suffered from the psychological and the physical traumas of the war. They faced concentration camps, abuse, and death. Those who were able to survive had lost most of their family members. This made it extremely difficult to reconstruct the Roma cultural and social networks after the war, and Julian had his hands full leading his Romani gypsy community into the modern times. His mother, Grace, had somehow survived the concentration camp, but the horrors that she had witnessed had changed her. She was kept alive only because she was considered a lab rat. She was subjected to medical experimentation at the hands of a mad scientist and an evil dictator. His mother, the matriarch of the community, had grown old and tired and would soon be passing on to her next life. Julian knew she wanted her granddaughter, Catherine, to take over her responsibilities. But he feared his daughter was not up to the task. She'd been given away as an infant and raised in the United States. She just didn't know the gypsy ways. She was not really one of them, despite her birthright, but she belonged to him. He resented the fact that he had never had the opportunity to know his daughter. Julian had loved Hannah, especially when he learned that she bore his child, but she'd betrayed him. She'd run away to the United States and then gave his daughter away to her sister. He would have killed Gunther to have her for himself, but after she left, he wanted to kill them both. Now Hannah and Gunther were both dead, but he still had a daughter, and he was determined to bring her back to Germany, where she belonged, even if he had to kidnap her to do it. He thought back to the years that had passed. He was bitter and hurt that Hannah would reject him the way she did. She could have been his bride, his queen, but she chose to run away, and then she returned to Gunther instead of coming back to him. He could never forgive her for that. Julian reached up to his throat and felt the bandages. His amulet was missing. "Nurse," he called in a voice that sounded weak. "My things, where are they?" he whispered. She shook her head. "My amulet, my necklace. I am never without it, please." The nurse, she left the room and spoke to the officer. She came back and nodded her head toward the officer. "I'm sorry, he'll see what he can do." Well, he knew the amulet was what kept him from transforming into a wolf. He wore it for protection against the rage that welled up inside of him and turned him into the beast. The amulet was powerful medicine, carved from the bones of his ancestors. It bore a sacred symbol that was known to work its magic on anyone who wore it. It was plain gypsy witchcraft. Perhaps it won't be necessary, he thought to himself. Maybe that's exactly how I'm going to escape. Jack and Kat sat in the living room of Kat's little house in Telluride, talking into the early hours of the morning and looking at the photographs that he'd brought back with him from Germany. Now, he still wondered who had brought the photos to Gerda's house, leaving him on the front step with his name written on the outside of the envelope. He'd been able to find the old German house in the photos and had learned that the family that had lived there in the early 1900s were Charles and Myrtle Kell. They had 2 children, Wilhelm and Grace. And various photographs showed the family posing in a family portrait. Others showed the children at different ages as they were growing up, and Kat was just astonished to see her likeness in the photographs. Grace looked exactly as she did when she was a child. The similarity in their features was just unnerving. There's got to be a connection with this family and ours, Kat thought. Well, Grace had run off with a gypsy, leaving her brother Wilhelm to inherit the farm. And he had married his childhood sweetheart, Prudence. They had 2 children as well, a boy and a girl. According to the land developer that Jack had met while in Germany, a man named Carl Van Cleve, Wilhelm had lost his son during the war, and his daughter had run away with a gypsy, just like her Aunt Grace had done. She was disinherited, and since Wilhelm and Prudence had no other heirs, they sold their house and land to Carl. Well, Kat rose and went to the kitchen for another bottle of wine and a pad of sticky notes. She began putting names on the notepad and laid out a detailed family tree on the coffee table. A few of the pieces were beginning to fall into place, but there were still so many missing parts of the puzzle. As the names were laid out, the story began to unfold in Kat's mind. I wonder if Grace is the old gypsy, the woman who said she was my grandmother. I would explain why I look so much like her. Well, we know she ran off with a gypsy, but we don't really know anything else about her. I think Grace is Julian's mom, and she is also the gypsy woman you met at Gerda's sister's house. My grandmother. Jack's head was spinning. One of the many things that has me puzzled is why Mom and Dad never told us anything about our German heritage. Why'd they keep so many secrets from us? Oh, Jack was wondering a lot of things. Kat replied that she thought it was to protect them. Their mother would have known the danger she was putting her family in, protecting a child whose real father might come looking for her. Raising the 2 siblings together in the safety of a loving family and on a big ranch was probably the best thing they could do for them. And her eyes just filled with tears with those thoughts. Jack got up and walked over to the sofa. Sitting down beside his sister, he put his arm around her shoulders. Listen, none of this makes any difference. You're still my little sister, and I'll always be here to protect you. Kat tucked her head into Jack's shoulder and said, I love you too, you big hairy beast. And they both got a laugh out of that. Meanwhile, over in Europe, Professor Luther was angry he'd let Jack slip through his hands. He had spent his entire adult life studying the ancestral lines of the Volkolak, a long line of gypsy werewolves that first came from Russia and then into Romania and Bulgaria in the 1500s. He needed blood, not because he was vampire or werewolf, but because he was a scientist and a chemist. He studied the DNA and the RNA of the bloodline and had spent his whole career mapping the blood. His peers laughed at him and thought he was crazy. At university, his classes were well attended only because they appealed to the students interested in the macabre or because they needed credit hours. The other faculty scoffed at him. He needed pure blood to prove his theories once and for all. He'd sampled other blood throughout the years, starting with his own roommate back when he was still a student. But until now, he had not had access to a pure bloodline, the blood of the Volkolak. The professor was intent on carrying on his father's work, as well as making a name for himself. As a very young boy, Luther had visited the laboratory where his father carried out his experiments on humans. His father was also a scientist and had been a close comrade of Adolf Hitler. His father was obsessed with werewolves and had been intent on learning everything he could about them. On Hitler, well, he had encouraged his work wholeheartedly because he was interested in everything that deemed supernatural or of the occult sciences. Hitler's goal was to create an elite force of hybrid killing machines. He needed to understand their bloodline so he could create a pure race of Aryan werewolves, men who were expendable and could be controlled. German military and SS police units rounded up as many as 1 million European Roma gypsies. They subjected them to arbitrary internment, sterilization, forced labor in concentration camps, deportation, and then mass murder. They sorted them into pureblood gypsies and half-breeds. The pureblood were subjected to medical experimentation. Their blood and saliva was tested for the enzymes and the proteins of the Volkolak. The half-breeds were deported to Poland to forced labor, or they were just killed, their bodies thrown into mass graves. Besides being drained of their blood and experimented upon, some gypsies were forced to bite soldiers who were then studied to determine if they were going to transform into werewolves. It was an exciting time for Luther's father. He was very young, eager to please, and thrilled to have the ear of the man who called himself the Wolf. Hitler took him under his wing and gave him free rein to carry out all of his lethal experiments on gypsy men, women, and children. He was given a position at the Technical University of Munich, the most prestigious research school at the time. Hitler and his father had been dead for many years now, but their dreams of creating a race of controlled werewolves lived on in Luther. The remaining pure bloodline of the Volkolak was hard to find. The gypsies that survived genocide were mostly a mixed race now. He knew Jack's blood was tainted, but he was only bitten by a werewolf of the Jaeger clan, hardly worth mentioning. But Jack's sister was pure. Luther had been trying for years to find a way to harvest a pure bloodline. He tried with Grace, but had failed, and her son Julian had been impossible to reach through his bodyguards and the secretive dealings. But when he learned that Julian had a child, he thought this might be his chance. He'd been searching for the girl named Catherine for many years now, and when Ludolf Jaeger phoned him and told him Jack Moore had stumbled right into their lap, he couldn't believe his dumb luck. He didn't have to find Catherine. Her brother would bring her right to him. And then he'd let him slip right through his fingers. Now he had to come up with a plan to get the two of them back to Germany. Well, Julian waited till the night shift at the hospital made their nightly rounds. There was still an armed guard outside his door. He'd be easy to take. The nurses, they'd scream and run. He was sure of that. Some fool doctor would probably try to act like a brave rescuer and get in the way. But he too would be easy to overcome. He hoped that his transformation would break the restraints on his wrists and ankles. Then he could easily escape. The night nurse came in to check the feeding tubes, and he saw that she was young and pretty. So he used his best Romani charm to sweet-talk her into loosening his constraints, just a little bit. He told her that he was so tired and couldn't sleep with the restraints pinching his skin. They were rubbing and chafing, and she would only need to loosen the restraints just a little, just to give him a little degree of comfort. The nurse glanced over at the guard and winked at Julian. She struck up a conversation with the officer outside the door and explained that she was concerned that the constraints on the prisoner were too tight. It was cutting off his circulation, and his hands and feet were beginning to turn blue. If they didn't loosen the restraints, the decreased blood flow to his extremities could cause pretty serious trauma. Her flirtatious smile was enough to get the officer to release the restraints. That was the break that Julian was hoping for. Years of experience had taught him how to transform his body at will. It was quick and it was thorough. Within seconds of the release of the constraints, Julian sprang from the bed. He was right on top of the officer before he even saw it coming. A blood-curdling scream escaped the nurse's lips. There was no time for the officer to reach for his gun. Blood spurted from the deep gash in the officer's neck, and his spine was broken. The nurse, momentarily frozen at the sight of the beast, turned to run. Julian easily caught her and snapped her neck as well. He fled down the corridor. Nurses and doctors were slamming doors behind them and climbing under desks as the beast ran from floor to floor looking for an exit. He let out a pathetic howl and found his way out of the building and into the night. The adrenaline soon left him. He was weaker than he thought. The blood loss from his wound had taken its toll on him. His burst of energy escaping the hospital was enough to leave him panting, trying to catch his breath. He needed to rest and he needed clothing. Who knew they were going to look for him? He could hear the sirens as squad cars raced to the hospital. He had run the 10 blocks or so to the Uncompahgre River and was hiding in the brush. He knew he could follow the river to get out of town. It was easy. Running as a wolf and fueled by adrenaline to pick up the scent of the river. But now he lay in the grass and felt too weak to go any further. He hadn't thought about what he would do once he escaped, and now he lay shivering and weak and unable to focus. He realized it was safer to stay in the form of a wolf than to walk naked as a man through the streets of town. In full wolf form, he was much larger than a normal-sized dog, but he still stood a better chance of not getting noticed. He needed to find some clothes. Well, he allowed himself to rest for a few minutes more, then slowly walked through the brush and willows that grew along the riverbank. There was a paved path, obviously a bike trail, that wound through the park and followed the river. Julian hoped to see someone riding by in the dark, someone, preferably a man, that he could overtake and steal his clothes. But he needed strength to do that. He needed to rest. He bedded down in soft grass, hidden amongst the stand of willows, and he slept. The professor stopped in the Jaeger Deli in Cologne. Ludolf came from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. He motioned for Luther to follow him to a table in the back where they could speak in private, away from the prying ears of the public. "I thought you had this covered," Ludolf said angrily. "You didn't follow my plan. You were supposed to take a sample of his blood that day and tell him it needed to be mixed with the blood of another family member. His only remaining relative is his sister, so you would have figured out a way to get her there. Why didn't you do what I told you?" Luther shrugged. "I concocted the story about returning before the full moon so it would sound more believable. I needed time to get the laboratory ready. You know I can't do this at the university. I need a lab where I can conduct my experiments without the eyes of the administration inspecting everything I do. They're a faculty who would do anything to get me fired. We can't risk some snooping around. If this experiment is successful, we can sell it to the Russians for billions. You know that." Ludolf's nostrils flared. "You fool. We had him right here." And Luther's eyes filled with anger. "We'll get him back here with the girl." Catherine woke to the sound of banging on her front door. It was the local sheriff. She invited him in for coffee, and they sat at the little Formica kitchen table. "You look like you didn't sleep much last night," the sheriff observed. Catherine explained that she and Jack had stayed up late planning her next art installment. "I think it would be a good idea that you watch your back. I really hate to tell you this, but Julian escaped the hospital last night. He killed an officer and he killed a nurse. There's a big manhunt on. We have deputies coming from all the neighboring counties to assist. I'm sure we'll track him down, but we have good reason to believe he'll be heading back up here." Just then, Jack walked into the room. "Morning, Jack," the sheriff said. "Hope you weren't planning on heading home any time soon." Jack poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down. He looked at Kat and said, "I'm not leaving her side." Well, Julian slept fitfully, curled up in a fetal position. He hadn't remained in full wolf form for this long in years. He ached all over. The wound in his neck had started bleeding again, and he felt weak and he felt hungry. He actually felt homesick. He knew the sun would be rising soon and he needed a plan. He wasn't worried about food. He could find cattle easily enough. The scent was strong. He knew there were cows and sheep nearby. Plenty of dogs easily snatched from yards and cats roaming the streets. He was more concerned about finding clothes. His ears, they picked up a sound, and he turned his head slightly to focus his hearing. If a wolf could grin, he knew that he'd have a big one. That sound was that of a bicycle coming up the path. Julian crouched in the bushes, waiting to spring. As the bike drew closer, he picked up the scent of soap, then the scent of man. This was going to be easy, he thought to himself. And if he was lucky, the man would be close to his size. The cyclist never saw it coming. In less time than it took to glance his way, the wolf had sprung on the man, knocking him from the bike. The man sprang up, but the wolf lunged at him. Julian didn't want to tear the clothing. He needed it. The man fell back, kicking and trying to pull the wolf's giant head back. Handfuls of hair in his hands, but even in his weakened state, Julian was much stronger of the two. He bit down on the helmet covering the man's head and crushed his skull. The body shivered, then it lay limp. Julian crouched over the man, lifted his neck, and let out a giant sigh. There would be no howling for the kill. He had no voice left in him. He lowered his head and began the transformation back into the form of a man. The clothes were loose, but they would work. The helmet was partially crushed, but Julian tried his best to straighten it, rinsed the blood off in the river, and put it on his head. It would help as disguise. The bike, it wasn't damaged at all. He hadn't ridden a bike since he was a boy, but even wobbly as he was, it would be transportation. Now he needed food. The sheriff told Jack and Kat that he would keep them apprised of the developments and left. Jack finished his cup of coffee and went off to take a shower. Catherine cleaned up the coffee dishes and was starting to load the laundry when Jack came out of the shower wearing jeans and no shirt, drying his hair with a towel. Kat looked over at him and gasped. "Jack, that amulet. It looks very similar to the one Julian was wearing when he came into the gallery. Why do you have it?" Catherine asked. Jack reached up and got a hold of it. He'd gotten so used to wearing it, he'd almost forgotten he had it on. "Well, I got it when I was in the village outside of Thale. It's for protection to keep from turning into a wolf," Catherine finished. "Did you know Mom had one too?" Luther hadn't been so angry in a very long time. How dare Ludolf talk to him as if he had made a mistake? He wished he had never told Ludolf about his plans to create a serum that could be used as a weapon in the military. That had been Hitler's goal, and his father had been so close to perfecting the serum right before Hitler's death. He had completed the research. All he needed was blood, the right blood, to create his serum through mitosis. His father had died before he could complete his life's work. But Luther had continued his father's research, and now he was sure he had the right sequencing and the right formula. During mitosis, a cell duplicates all of its contents, including its chromosomes, and splits to form two identical daughter cells. Now, this process is carefully controlled by certain genes in the blood. Creating a werewolf serum was simple epigenetics. It changes the genetic code of the cell without changing the DNA. The epigenetic modification of the blood occurs by methylation, which involves the attachment of a small chemical group containing of one carbon atom, 3 hydrogen atoms to the DNA building blocks. When methyl groups are present on a gene, that gene is turned off or silenced, and no protein is produced from that gene. And that is how a body can transform itself from man to wolf and back to man. His father had perfected it. All that was missing was the one protein needed from the blood of a pure Volkolock bloodline. With Catherine's blood, Luther could now do what his father could not. He could produce a serum that would turn any soldier into a wolf, a hybrid fighting machine. No one would stand a chance against them. Luther knew he could sell his formula to the Russians for more money than he could ever imagine, but he needed as much blood as he could get his hands on for his research. Ludolf had been paid handsomely for his involvement in Luther's scheme. He was able to provide a continuous supply of bodies and blood for Luther's experiments. In trade, he was promised half of the wealth they would acquire Once the formula for the serum was sold to the Russians, Luther did not intend for Ludolf to live long enough to enjoy his share. Kat brought a jewelry box out of her bedroom and showed it to Jack. This was Mom's. When she died, I kept it. She opened it, and a little music box tinkled out the song Clair de Lune. Inside the box was their mom's wedding ring, a beautiful garnet necklace, and an amulet that was almost identical to Jack's. Do you think Mom was a werewolf, Jack? I remember seeing her wear this. It was always tucked in her blouse. I asked her about it once, and she told me that it was just something silly from childhood. I forgot all about it. Jack looked at Kat pensively. I wonder if that photograph I brought with me from Germany is a photo of Hannah when she was young. The wolf that is leaning over the woman in the photo could be Julian. In the photo, it looks as if he has bitten her. Maybe he thought that was a way of keeping her. We know Hannah was a wolf. Maybe Mom was one too. There's a way we could find out, Kat said. We need to find Julian. Julian was pretty unsteady on the bicycle, but he was quickly getting the hang of it. He knew he was in Montrose. The nurse had told him that. He remembered when he drove to Telluride that he had driven through Montrose to get there. So that must mean he was somewhere fairly close. He didn't have a phone, and he didn't want to ask directions. He followed the river as far as the bike path went. Then he had to cross over to a paved road. He found himself by a high school. He figured the kids wouldn't have any clue that he was wanted by the police, so he walked his bike to a group of students standing outside the school. They were sneaking cigarettes before class. He casually asked if someone could front him a smoke, and one of the students pulled out a pack of Marlboros and offered one to him. He told them he wanted to ride his bike to Telluride, and the kids were impressed. Wow, that's quite a ride. Telluride's like 60 miles from here. I've ridden my bike as far as Ridgeway, but I've never gone as far as Telluride. Julian pointed toward the south. So Ridgeway is that way, right? One of the kids answered, yeah, it's right where you turn to head up to Telluride, and it's only half the distance. Much easier to ride, dude. Julian thanked them and headed south. Jack and Kat got into her truck and headed out of town. Kat's idea might be crazy, Jack thought to himself, but he's probably the only one who can answer our questions. Jack didn't like the idea of Kat being anywhere near that man, but Kat insisted on going along. He wasn't sure how they'd find Julian when half the police force in the entire area was hunting for him, but Jack knew his scent, and if anyone would track him down, it would be Jack. They hoped to find out the truth about the photographs, about their family ties, and what was expected of Kat now that she knew the truth of who her real father was. Kat was sure that he didn't mean her any harm. He had ample opportunity to hurt her, bite her, or even kill her when he had her in captivity. Jack wasn't so sure, though. He'd fought that beast. He also had the confidence of knowing who was the stronger of the two. Well, the land between Telluride and Ridgeway is some of the prettiest ranch land in the West. The sprawling R.L. Ranch is a 16,000-acre spread beneath the snow-capped San Juans, and it's owned by a fashion designer, Ralph Lauren, and his wife, Ricky. The awe-inspiring view makes one take a deep breath as they pass through here. Jack thought about selling his Montana ranch and settling here, near Kat, once they got their lives back. Well, would they ever live normal lives again? Jack wondered to himself. Kat was quiet, and she was absorbed in her own thoughts. He looked over at her. When their parents died, Jack had taken it pretty rough. Sometimes he thought Kat was the stronger of the two of them. She'd been away at school, and he knew it was tough for her to not have been there to say goodbye. Their parents had been in a car accident driving home from a Montana Stock Growers Association convention near Billings. They'd been hit head-on by a drunk driver. Their dad was killed in the accident, but Mom held on for a few days. The last words she whispered, holding Jack's hand while in the hospital, was, "Take care of your sister." Jack told her with tears in his eyes that he always would, no matter what. Well, they pulled into Ridgeway and they took the turn onto Highway 550 to head on into Montrose. About halfway, and Jack picked up the scent. "He's near here, I can smell him." Julian had ridden just about as far as his legs could take him. He'd expended too much energy fighting his way out of the hospital and taking down the cyclist. Now he was riding a bicycle of all things. He pulled off the road into a clump of bushes and he laid down on the ground. He didn't think he could go any further. He needed to rest. His neck was bleeding again. And he had tied the windbreaker that he'd pulled off the cyclist around his neck like a scarf, but it didn't do much to staunch the bleeding. He hadn't bothered stopping to eat. That meant killing something, and he just didn't have the energy for it. But he knew he had to do it. For the first time in his life, he was actually scared. He realized how near death he had come, how much blood he had lost. He was worried that if he transformed into a wolf now, he wouldn't have the strength to kill. He was dizzy and he was weak. He closed his eyes and he slept. Jack pulled the truck off the road and got out to sniff the air. He looked over at Kat and told her he knew that they were very close. He turned slowly around, trying to determine if the scent was coming from the north or the south. Had he already passed by here? Was he on foot? Was he in wolf form? It was possible he'd stolen a car, but Jack didn't think the scent would be that strong if he was in a vehicle. He got back in the truck and he drove forward. Another mile up the road, he stopped suddenly, hitting the brakes. He jumped out of the truck and holding his nose up in the air and sniffing. He saw a bicycle leaning up against the fence near the bushy stand of sagebrush. "He's here," Jack whispered to Kat. He pulled out his gun and he quietly walked toward the bushes. The closer he got, the stronger the scent became. Laying there, under the bushes, barely breathing, was Julian. His eyes fluttered open as Jack knelt over him. He let Jack pick him up and carry him to the truck. The Wolf Story, Part 8 of the Hunting the Wolfman series, Mexico. The highway past Cimarron was slick with a thin layer of fresh snow. Julian lay in the small back seat of the pickup truck. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently. Kat reached back and felt his forehead. "Hell, he's burning up, Jack. We should get him to the hospital." "I know, but it would be a death sentence for him. He's killed an officer of the law and a nurse. They're not going to try very hard to keep him alive. And even if they do, he'll be in a federal prison for the rest of his life. They're not going to let us talk to him, not at the hospital and certainly not in prison. I really don't think he's going to make it, Kat. I think we should try to talk with him now while we can," he reasoned with her. Jack knew they'd be searching for Julian all along the route between Montrose and Telluride. He had let the local sheriff think he was taking Kat back to his ranch in Montana for a few weeks, just to keep her safe from her stalker. But he also knew that if they couldn't find Julian anywhere in western Colorado, well, they'd start looking for him in Montana. He was trying to formulate a plan. He didn't like that he was harboring a fugitive from the law, particularly one who had threatened his sister's life and killed an officer and a nurse and who knows what else. He was a dangerous man and a ruthless killer. But the man who lay in the back seat of the truck was clinging to life, and he didn't seem like much of a threat at the moment. Kat spoke up. "Jack, what are we going to do? We can't get him back to Germany. He's a criminal. But he's also my father. I don't know. Maybe that doesn't mean much at this point, but I'd still like to get some answers from him." Well, Kat knew Jack was trying to formulate a plan in his head. He was quiet, and he had that determined look on his face that he got when he was deep in thought. Now, Kat wondered just what they had gotten themselves into. They turned off on the 149 heading toward Lake City. It was the long way to head towards New Mexico, but a much less traveled route. No one would be searching for the fugitive along this little stretch of highway. It was heavily forested with many switchbacks, and it was really slow traveling, but safe. Jack had decided the best thing he would do now would be to get him down to the border and into Mexico somehow, if he lived that long. Well, Jack tried to take the switchbacks as easy as he could. Occasionally, he'd hit a rough patch of road, and they'd hear a groan from the back seat. At least that meant he was still alive. Well, by the time they got to South Park, several hours later, Julian was beginning to stir. They stopped at a market for bandages, food, and gas, and Kat had a gun in her lap just in case she needed it while Jack was in the market. But Julian couldn't even attempt to sit up. Too weak. They stopped outside of town and poured some water in Julian's mouth. He could swallow, but he was too weak to say anything, while Kat wrapped fresh gauze bandages around his neck wound. It had bled quite a bit, but it looked clean. Well, Julian, for his part, he just closed his eyes and slept. It was well past dark by the time they reached Chama, New Mexico. They booked a cabin at the Elkhorn Lodge and carried Julian inside. It was just a private little cabin, secluded and safe. Jack cooked some ground beef, and Kat attempted to feed Julian a little of it. The meat, it seemed to revive him. He was able to sit up and drink some water, and even gave Kat a little smile and whispered thank you to her. The cabin had 2 beds and a pull-out sofa, but Jack didn't expect he'd sleep much anyway. As weak as Julian appeared to be, he still wasn't sure he could trust him. He told Kat to get some sleep, and he'd sit up and keep an eye on things. Jack watched the man sleep, pondering how their lives had been so disrupted by the last few years' events, starting with the cattle that were being attacked back in Montana, the death of Hannah and Gunther Jaeger. It seemed like ages ago. And now to find out that Hannah was really Kat's mother. It just didn't seem possible. In an ironic way that was almost more difficult to believe than the fact that they were really werewolves, Jack chuckled to himself. And then they had hunted down Hans Jaeger in Washington, and now they find out it was Kat's brother. Things like this just didn't happen in real life. It was like waking up in a bad movie, only these characters were real. He thought about how his parents had hidden this secret side of their lives so well, and once again he wondered if his mother had also been a wolf. Had Dad known any of this? He was a conservative Montana cattleman, a cowboy. Jack couldn't picture his dad buying into any of this. It all seemed so unbelievable. He was living in a fairy tale of wolves and gypsies, and he still couldn't wrap his head around it. He missed his ranch. It had only been a couple of months since he'd been home, but it felt like it had been gone a couple of years. He knew his ranch manager was handling things pretty well back home. He didn't have to worry about that. No, he was worried that life would never go back to normal at this point. He watched Julian stir restlessly, murmuring something in his sleep. This man, Kat's father, was wanted for killing an officer. How in the hell was he going to get him back across the border? Let alone get him back to Germany. And should he? Well, part of him wanted to just turn the guy over to local authorities. Be done with him. Maybe they should just get some information from him, then drop him off at the local jail. He didn't think Kat would go for that. He thought he could understand the lack of reasoning that goes with being a predator under attack. An animal in the wild thinks only of itself. Killing is an instinctual necessity, a way for a species to survive. But did that make it right? Absolutely not. Not in this case, anyways. Julian stirred and opened his eyes. He seemed to be having trouble figuring out just where he was. He had a confused look in his eyes, and they settled on Jack sitting in the corner. He tried to lean up on an elbow and said something in a low whisper, but Jack couldn't make out what he said. He laid his head back on the pillow and closed his eyes, and within minutes he was back asleep. Jack dozed in his chair, ready to spring awake at the slightest sound, but the rest of the night was quiet. Well, Kat woke early and made coffee. She encouraged Jack to get some sleep. She'd stay up now and watch Julian. Jack handed her the gun and told her to wake him immediately if Julian stirred. He was grateful to get a few hours' sleep before they'd travel on towards Mexico. He still wasn't sure how they'd hide Julian from the Border Patrol and get him across the border, but it certainly should be easier to pass into Mexico than it was to cross the border from Mexico. But a few hours of sleep might be enough to clear his mind and help him find a solution. Well, Jack woke to the smell of bacon and voices. Kat was sitting on the bed next to Julian, helping him eat bacon and scrambled eggs. Julian was sitting up in bed, pillows tucked up behind him. Jack shook his head at Kat. So much for waking him if Julian stirred. He was sitting up and eating and having a conversation with her. "What the hell?" Jack said. "I thought you were going to wake me up." Kat rolled her eyes and got up to pour him a cup of coffee. "We're fine. Julian's feeling better. He's very grateful that you're helping him. We've been talking about what his village is like in Germany." And 6 hours later, they were in Deming, New Mexico. They took a back road from there into Columbus on the border. It was pretty desolate. Columbus is a tiny town that sits right on the border where in 1916, Pancho Villa attacked a U.S. Army garrison, and General John Black Hawk Pershing and his troops spent 9 months chasing Villa through Mexico. It was twilight when they arrived, and across the broad sweep of the desert floor they could see the dark mass of the border fence, crowned by a chain of floodlights. The wall in this part was 18 to 20 foot high, designed to funnel people toward the port of entry or around it. A dirt road ran parallel to the fence and led to the port of entry in Antelope Wells, down in the state's Boot Heel region. The gate is closed at night, but even during the day, when only a few vehicles drive through, this is probably the loneliest border crossing in America. Of the 43 official ports of entry along the southern U.S. border, this one is the least used. Far ahead, a pair of headlights shone through the dark emptiness, headed straight towards them. Hell, it might be Border Patrol, Jack thought to himself, or it could be one of Miguel Flores's men. Jack hoped it was the latter. Miguel was an old acquaintance from Jack's rodeo days. He'd met him on the circuit and knew him as one of the best steer ropers and bull riders he'd ever known. Miguel owned a large horse ranch deep in the heart of Mexico. Calling him had been a shot in the dark, and renewing their acquaintance was risky for several reasons. But if anyone could get them across the border, it would be Miguel. Miguel had been involved in a few shady dealings back when Jack knew him as a young cowboy. Over the years since then, Miguel had managed to establish a prominent horse breeding operation in the United States that allowed he and his investors to launder millions of dollars in drug money. So Miguel had devised an elaborate scheme in which Mexican businessmen paid for horses worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from their own bank accounts, so the purchases would appear legitimate. And then the cartel would later reimburse the businessmen, and the horse's ownership would be transferred to Miguel. The operation amounted to a foothold in the United States for one of Mexico's most dangerous criminal networks. Miguel now had a slew of bodyguards and connections that rivaled that of the largest drug cartels in Mexico. He was a ruthless businessman and someone you did not want on your bad side. He had once dumped the bodies of 49 people, without heads, hands, or feet, in garbage bags along a busy highway in northern Mexico. Miguel's men knew most of the Border Patrol, and they knew who they could pay off and who they couldn't. When Jack called him, he sounded excited to help his old friend out and didn't ask any questions. Now, many years ago, when they were both in their early 20s and doing the rodeo circuit, Miguel had stolen Jack's girlfriend. Their friendship had ended in a fist fight, and Jack hadn't talked to Miguel in all these years, but now all it took was one phone call to renew the friendship. The white pickup truck screeched to a stop with a billowing cloud of dust. Miguel himself stepped out with a big smile on his face. "Jack Moore, it's damn good to see you. And who's this pretty girl you got here with you? Is that little Cat? Where's her pigtails?" He wrapped Cat in a big bear hug and stood back and smiled at them both. "Let's get you out of here. We've got the entry port taken care of, and we can drive straight through. Just follow me." Jack smiled at Cat. See? Those years of rodeoing finally paid off. Cat let out a big sigh. "I hope this isn't a mistake," she said. "I'm afraid this could get us all killed." Jack gunned the pickup, following the cloud of dust ahead of him. They drove through the night at heart-racing speeds, through the desert and into the mountains. Hairpin turns were taken on two wheels, it seemed to Jack. Cat, she just closed her eyes and held on for dear life. And Julian lay in the back seat, groaning at every bump in the road. Miguel, he was used to these roads. Jack was not. It was morning when they arrived at Miguel's ranch, and the roosters were strutting around the circular drive at the front of the hacienda. They squawked and fluttered away as the trucks came to a screeching halt. Miguel jumped out and yelled, "Welcome, amigos," with a huge smile on his face. Jack and Cat stepped out of the pickup on shaky legs. "You look a little green in the face, Catarina," he laughed. Well, Rancho del Sol was a spacious estate with green lawns, exotic trees, and flowering bushes, surrounding a beautiful hacienda with courtyards, fountains, sprawling horse barns, and lush pastures of green. It was the most beautiful and luxurious horse ranch Jack had ever seen. He remembered Miguel as a girl-crazy romantic fool in his early 20s. Since then, he'd had more wives than most men have girlfriends. Looks like he'd done pretty good for himself, Jack thought. Coming down the steps to greet them was a beautiful Mexican woman, wearing a brightly colored skirt and blouse. Her dark hair was pulled into a plaited braid which hung over her shoulder in a long twist. She was Juanita, the sister of Miguel Flores. Jack remembered her as a pretty young teenager that turned all the boys' heads. Now she was every bit as gorgeous. She walked up to Jack and planted a big old kiss on his cheek. He blushed and he removed his cowboy hat. "Howdy, ma'am," he said, dipping his head in a respectful nod. She laughed and slugged him in the shoulder. Miguel walked over to the truck. "So tell me what this contraband is you've smuggled into my country." The kitchen cook, Rosa, had spread out a huge breakfast on the outdoor patio. Huevos rancheros with homemade tortillas, hot coffee, freshly squeezed orange juice, and a shot of tequila awaited each of the guests and family members. Julian managed to sit at the table and eat a little bit of this food, and after breakfast they were shown to their rooms and collapsed in their beds. It was expected that they would all join Miguel later for dinner, but until then, it was time to rest. Julian was given a room of his own with a guard outside his door, as Jack requested. Miguel didn't question him. It was a common request in his line of work. For the next several days, Juanita took personal care of Julian's wounds. She took him under her wing and tended to him like an injured bird. It was hard to believe that he was the same man who had kidnapped Cat and attacked Jack. He strode around the hacienda like one of the roosters, Juanita holding his arm and encouraging him to lean on her for balance. Miguel and Jack inspected the horses. Miguel's pride bursting with every compliment from Jack. He loved his prize horses and didn't get to show them off very often. Cat was happily sketching her surroundings, already planning a future art installation based on the colorful art of Mexico. It was easy to forget that a manhunt was being led back in Colorado. The sheriff would soon be wondering where Jack and Cat had disappeared to. Jack's concocted story of taking Cat to his ranch in Montana to protect her while the stalker and cop killer was on the loose was only going to buy him a little bit of time. It wouldn't take long for them to be suspects in Julian's disappearance. Miguel knew Jack was hiding something. He hadn't become a successful businessman and drug lord by taking a man at his word. He knew when he was being lied to, but he also sensed that Jack was in some trouble and needed his help. The bond of friendship was as strong as the bond of family in Miguel's mind. In his line of work, he had few friends and even fewer that he could trust. He was willing to help Jack, no matter what the real story was. Miguel was a bit concerned that his sister Juanita had taken such a liking to Julian. He was a bit older than she was, but there was a wildness about him, a feral look that he knew his sister couldn't resist. You see, she was wild too, always had been. She'd never settled for a man but had taken many lovers. He'd just never seen her to take to someone like this, though. It made him wonder if maybe she'd met her match this time, or it could be just a passing fancy. She certainly had those. Whatever it was, he liked seeing her flit about the house like a new bride. Miguel watched as Julian and Juanita strode through the garden arm in arm. Juanita didn't leave his side, but now that Julian was healing and able to talk in more than just a whisper, it was time to get some answers from him and from Jack. The golden light of dusk settled on the trees and the bats were swooping around overhead. Miguel started a fire in the large outdoor fire pit and pulled up a couple of chairs. He opened a bottle of his finest tequila to loosen the tongues and let the story begin. Julian and Juanita sat on a bench side by side, her arm tucked into his. Kat, Jack, and Miguel sat in cushioned iron chairs gazing at the fire. Several yards away, the armed men Miguel hired to guard his property, they were all busy patrolling the grounds. It was peaceful, and Miguel was ready to start asking questions. Jack, you need my help, and you know I won't deny you that. But I need to know what the hell's going on here. Why, after all these years, you're here at my house, and don't tell me it's because you needed a vacation. Well, Jack looked at Kat. For the first time, he felt he could tell the whole story. Maybe it was the tequila, but for some reason he felt he could trust Miguel with the truth. Kat nodded to him. She felt the same way, and she hoped Julian would be able to fill in the missing pieces. It was another sleepless night. They finished that bottle of tequila and opened another as the story continued to pour forth. Miguel felt bonded to Jack like a brother now that he knew what Jack had gone through the past few years. Parts of his story sounded like fiction, but in Mexico, mystery was a way of life. Jack's story began with the Jaeger's transformation, their son they hunted down in Washington, his friends Parker and Doc who had died, the trip to Germany to find a cure, the discovery that Kat was really Hannah and Julian's daughter, and now here they were, smuggling a criminal across the border into Mexico. Julian didn't seem particularly interested until Jack mentioned seeking out Professor Luther in Germany to try to get a cure. He glanced up with a look of concern at the mention of that name. Once Jack had finished his story, they all looked at Julian. "Your turn," Jack said. Julian began his story. "My mother's name is Grace. She ran away from home at the age of 15 because she had fallen in love with a gypsy named Sergio. She was wed in a gypsy ceremony around a campfire when she turned 16. Grace and Sergio were happy until the war came. German soldiers were rounding up gypsies and sending them to concentration camps. Gypsies were considered less than human, and being of gypsy blood was a death sentence. Several members of their village bore the mark of the wolf, so it was decided amongst the community that every man and woman would be bitten so they could protect themselves in the village by turning into wolves when the soldiers came to take them. Some were not able to stand the transformation and they died, but those who did transform fought as best as they could. But they were outnumbered. Many were killed and many more were captured and taken to concentration camps where they were forced to endure terrible medical experiments. Hitler became obsessed with the idea of creating an army of werewolves by using gypsies' blood to create a serum which could be injected into his soldiers. He called himself the Wolf, and his special forces teams were known as the Werewolves. It was a Nazi plan to create a resistance force that would operate behind enemy lines. In the fall of 1944, Heinrich Himmler initiated Operation Werewolf and began organizing an elite troop of volunteer forces. Extensive medical experiments were done on the captured gypsies. Those that had the right blood sequence had their blood literally drained from them and replaced with a saline solution. Most of these unfortunate men, women, and children, they died. My mother was one of the few that survived. My father Sergio had bitten my mother and taught her how to transform at will. That is what saved her life. She was kept bound in a cage and experimented upon. Soldiers were brought to her and she was forced to bite them. They would then be tested to see if her wolf blood mixed with their blood and if they were able to transform into wolves. After the war ended in 1945, someone eventually freed her. She made her way back home only to find that most of the village was gone. Her husband Sergio had escaped confinement and was leading a band of rogue gypsies in the Harz Mountains. Word got to him that Grace was still alive and they were once again reunited. Several years later, we were born. We? Kat interjected. I have a twin brother named Mikhail. Our people were still suffering from the discriminations of the war. We were gypsies, which meant we were not welcome in common society. You can imagine what that must have been like as we grew into our teenage years. We didn't understand why people hated us, why we weren't allowed to go into town and socialize with other kids our age. We were confined to our little village, but we would sneak into the nearby towns to watch the people and try to fit in. We learned to steal what we could not have. I first saw Hannah as she was hanging clothes on a line outside of her home. I thought she was the prettiest girl I had ever seen. I remember that day so well. It was late August, and the leaves were just beginning to turn gold and matched her beautiful golden hair. But I was shy, and I was afraid to approach her. I started hanging around the edge of the forest near her home, watching her from a distance. There was a large rock where her fence met the forest's edge, and I started leaving her little gifts there. Flowers, trinkets, gypsy jewelry. I'd watch as she'd wander over to check the rock and smile when she found what I had left her. She started leaving me little baked goods, cupcakes and muffins and delicacies wrapped in a pretty cloth. It wasn't long before we were leaving little love notes for each other. By early winter, we were sneaking away into the forest, cuddled under a blanket around a campfire. We spent every moment that we could steal in each other's arms, until the day her husband discovered us. He had followed her tracks in the snow and found us lying in each other's arms, cuddled between blankets next to the fire. We fought, but Gunther had a gun and shot me, leaving me to bleed to death in the snow. My brother Mikhail found me and carried me back to our village. It was weeks before I was strong enough to stand. I'd lost a lot of blood. I asked my brother if he had seen Hannah, and he told me she was gone, that she had run away. One of the servant girls had told him that Hannah thought I was dead and that she was pregnant with my child. The servant girl helped Hannah escape and go aboard a ship for the United States where her sister lived. She didn't know where. She said Gunther was trying to find her. Mikhail told the servant girl that if she should hear from Hannah to let her know that I was alive and that I would come for her. It was over a year later I received a letter from Hannah. She had given birth to a little dark-haired girl named Catherine, and she gave our daughter to Rose to protect her. She told me Gunther had found her and they were going to stay in America and not to look for her. She told me she did not love me and to stay away. I could never forgive her for that. I could have protected her. Our village would have protected her. I was angry and I felt betrayed. And now it's taken me all these years to find you, Catherine. Well, the fire had burnt down to embers and the second bottle of tequila was nearly spent. It had been a long night. More of the pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, but there was still the future to decide. What role did Kat play in all this? What were they going to do with Julian? And why did Julian flinch when Professor Luther's name was mentioned? And who had given Jack the envelope of photographs, and why? Miguel got up and yawned loudly. Amigos, I think we need to sleep. But tomorrow night, we will continue our story. I want to tell you about my Mexican ancestors, the Nahual. I think you'll find that my story is connected to yours in a very interesting way. And this is part 9 of the Wolfman Series, A Werewolf in Mexico. Rosa, the cook, had coffee brewing and breakfast ready. Miguel normally stayed up all night and slept in the next day, so Rosa was used to accommodating his nocturnal hours. Fresh tortillas and grilled beef with homemade salsa, plates of fruit, cactus flower fritters. Everything was colorful and fresh. I could get used to this, Jack said as he loaded his plate full of food. Rosa poured fresh squeezed orange juice into his glass. Hair of the dog, she said under her breath as she placed a bottle of tequila in front of him. Cat giggled. Juanita and Julian sat side by side. Julian's story the night before had not scared her away. If anything, she seemed even more attentive to his needs, if that was even possible. She filled his plate, poured his orange juice, peeled his oranges. Jack rolled his eyes and Cat giggled again. Julian, you dog, Jack said. After all we went through in Colorado, here you are just as passive and sweet as a young pup. Julian laughed. And Cat added, just for the record, I think you owe us both an apology. Julian agreed. Sometimes the beast just takes over. Normally I can control it, but there are times when my emotions are so strong I can't hold it back. I'm sorry I scared you, Cat. I'm sorry I fought with you, Jack. Juanita took his face in her hand and turned it toward her. I'd like to see what happens when you can't hold it back, she said. Oh, come on, guys, Cat laughed. You're making me lose my appetite. Miguel finally joined the breakfast table. He was his usual jovial self, a big smile on his face as he greeted his guests. Finish up. We're going on a trip today. There is someone I want you to meet. Miguel, Juanita, and their 3 guests plied into Miguel's SUV and headed to the little town of Creel, nestled in the heart of the Sierra Madre Mountains, about 40 miles from Miguel's ranch. It was a pretty town filled with lakes, waterfalls, rivers, rocky ridges, forest caves, and the stunning Copper Canyons. But most importantly, it is where the Tarahumara people live. Miguel explained that the Tarahumaras are a group of indigenous people living in the Sierra Madres. Most still practice a traditional lifestyle, living in natural shelters and caves or cliff overhangs. They are known as the Raramuri, which means runners on foot, and are known for their long-distance running ability. They can run up to 200 miles in one session, over a period of 2 days, through their homeland of rough canyon terrain. They mainly hunt with bow and arrow, but they are known for their ability to run down deer and wild turkeys. They literally run their prey to death in what is called persistence hunting. The Sierra Madre is one of the most productive drug-growing regions on Earth. Logging is controlled by the Mexican government, but loggers and drug lords use the forest to grow marijuana and opium. Drug cartels have links with logging companies that launder money in the drug trade and pay off the government to use the land as they wish. In recent years, the Tarahumara have been exploited by the drug cartels. They're taking their land and they're forcing them to grow drugs instead of their own food crops. Narcotics trafficking is also a problem. Cartels exploit the Tarahumara's ability as long-distance runners and force them to run illegal drugs into the United States. See, they'll kidnap a child and tell the family that they'll only give it back if they run the drugs. Many times they make it, but often they're captured or killed. Then the child will be sold to human traffickers or killed. It's a terrible shame. But the reason we're going there today is because of their cattle. The Tarahumara are also known for a rare and pure genetic line of cattle. The Raramuri Criollo cattle are indigenous to the Copper Canyon region of the Sierra Madres. They're descendants of the first cattle brought to Mexico by Hernan Cortez and Villalobos. Until recently, these cattle were geographically isolated in the remote Rio Oteros region of the Copper Canyon. And the Tarahumara have raised this indigenous breed for over 500 years with no genetic introgression from outside breeds, which means it's very important to preserve their unique genetics. Cattlemen will pay a handsome dollar for pure breeding stock. It's interesting that the Tarahumara use the cattle for milk and companionship and rarely as a food source. The cows are often kept indoors adjacent to the house as a source of winter heat. Miguel added, and yet it is some of the finest tasting beef you can find. Jack mentioned that he'd heard of this rare breed of cattle. He had been a brand inspector in Montana and was a cattle rancher. This was the kind of thing he was interested in. He explained that the Criollo are related to the Corriente cattle that you'll see in the desert areas of North America, and that no registered breed association exists for this biotype of cow. Ranchers in desert regions are excited about this breed because they do well in arid desert areas. They have milk that rivals that of a Jersey cow, and they're very tender and lean meat. And they are very gentle. In fact, they'll tag around after you like a dog. Well, that's all very interesting, but what does it have to do with us? Cat asked. 2 reasons, Miguel explained. First, I'm buying more breeding stock for my ranch. I positioned myself as the top exporter of this beef before my competition could lay claim to it. It's a smart move and a clean way to move some money. And secondly, the person we are going to meet is a narwhal. That is Mexico's equivalent to a werewolf. He is a shapeshifter, although he is more coyote than wolf. Just outside the little town of Creel, they were greeted by a man named Asa. He was standing in the road as if he knew the exact moment they would arrive. He was dressed in the traditional Tarahumara cloth headband and loincloth, held together by a strap of wool wrapped twice around the waist. He raised his arm in a salute, and Miguel pulled up beside him. He nodded once, then took off in a run. Miguel followed in his white SUV. Several miles, and at a steep incline, the man raced ahead. Doesn't he want to ride with us? Cat asked. I'm sure he's never been in a vehicle, Miguel answered. It is their custom to run wherever they can. Nestled underneath the ridgetop was a small house built out of stone right into the side of the mountain. Miguel explained that some of the Tarahumara still live in caves like this. Asa had lived in this cave for 68 years. Chickens were running around, and there was a fence enclosure made from sticks where several of the Criollo cattle of different colors were penned. Others roamed around freely. Asa spoke in a language that was not traditional Spanish, but a unique Mexican dialect that Jack had never heard before. Miguel was able to translate most of what he said. The Tarahumara follow an ancient religion that has bred into them a moral code so strict that they are unable to tell a lie. Over the centuries, this value system has actually caused physiological changes in their brain that preclude speaking anything but the truth. Nor can they cheat or fail to aid a fellow tribesman, but their way of life is slowly eroding away. The drug cartels are taking away their land and forcing them even higher into the mountains. They've fought off Spanish colonization, missionaries trying to convert them to Christianity, and now they have to rise up and fight again. Only this time it is the drug trade they are fighting. But they cannot fight with guns and swords. They cannot fight with aid from the government. The Mexican government does nothing to protect these people. The only way they can fight is to make the drug lords and the loggers fear them. Asa might be a narwhal, but he is old and he is the one man standing alone. If his people could all be shapeshifters, they could fight for themselves. Asa requests that you turn his people into wolves. Miguel explained that El Lobo, the Mexican gray wolf, has not been seen in Mexico for many years. They once numbered in the thousands, but they were killed by the mid-70s, with just a handful existing in zoos in the United States. The Mexican gray wolf is the most endangered subspecies of wolves in the world because of compromised genetics, human intolerance, and reluctance to reintroduce them into Mexico. Asa had a vision many months ago that 2 men from 2 different countries would come to save his people. He told me they were wolves. I laughed at him, and I thought it was just the ramblings of an old man. The last time I was here, about 4 months ago, he told me that these 2 men would appear at my home, and I was to bring them to him. Again I laughed. But then you called me and said you needed help getting into Mexico, and you wouldn't tell me why. Now, after hearing your story last night, I knew it was Asa's vision coming true. I told you that we would continue our story tonight at the campfire. I want to tell you of my Mexican ancestors, but I thought it was important for you to meet Asa first. When you hear my story, you'll understand why. Miguel spoke to Ozza for several minutes in private and then prepared to leave. I told him we'd be back in 3 days with a truck to load the cattle and an answer from you. They said their goodbyes, and Ozza put his hand on Jack's shoulder and looked deep into his eyes. He nodded his head, then repeated the same with Julian and then Kat. Jack, did you feel that? Kat whispered to Jack as they walked over to the SUV. What, you mean when he looked into your eyes? Yes, I felt something stir inside me. It was like he looked right into my very soul. But it was more than that. I felt this thing. I can't really describe it, but I felt something stir inside me. Jack, you must do this for him, she pleaded. Jack sighed. I know, I felt it too. He wondered if life would ever be normal again. That night, Miguel once again had a campfire roaring in the fire pit outside. He came strolling out of the house holding 2 bottles of tequila in one hand, 5 shot glasses in the other. He poured everyone a shot, then Miguel began his story. Like many countries, Mexican has its own werewolf legends, but ours are usually black dogs or coyotes that attack and kill people, or livestock. They can run extremely fast, so they're hard to catch. They're very strong. They're loners. They're very protective of their territory. If one narwhal enters another's territory, it's a fight to the death. They can be killed if wounded badly enough. And the Mexicans also believe that if one is harmed while it's in animal form, they will show the same injury when they return to human form. And this was another way of identifying them. In different parts of Mexico, there are different legends. In the mountains of La Milinchi, it's thought that the villagers there are all women werewolves or witches. It's said that they sneak into homes at night to kill and eat children. That hardly seems believable, he laughed. When I was growing up, my parents told me stories about their childhood. They were born in a small pueblo in Mexico where many of the people are Nahuales. At night, these people have the ability to transform into an animal, such as a dog, or a coyote, or a snake, or a cat. They are powerful when they are in animal form, and they can do evil things. It was easy to know who the Nahuals were because they liked to wander at night. They could easily see in the dark. Sometimes you would see a dog walk out a door at night, but in the morning it would be a human who would walk back in. My mama was cursed by a Nahual. Every time my mama was pregnant, she suffered. When she was about to give birth, she saw a black dog with red eyes at nighttime. She lost 4 children. They died before she could give birth to them. Her stomach would turn purple and then black. My papa took her to a curandera who gave her a herbal medicine to take and perform a ritual cleansing. The curandera told her it was an evil Nahual causing her suffering, that it was a woman who was in love with my father. She wanted revenge because my father married my mother instead of her. She was the black dog that my mother would see at night. The curandera was a bruja, a witch. She cured my mom by putting a spell of protection around her. My mother was able to give birth to me a year later, but as I grew up, I would see a black dog following me around if I was out at night. It stayed back, but if I turned to look at it, it would glare at me with red eyes. One night I awoke to find the black dog in my bedroom. It was in the corner of my room staring at me with those red eyes. I threw my pillow at it, and it sprung into the bed and bit me. I tried to fight it off, but it ripped into my arm. I screamed, and my dad ran into the room. The dog jumped out the window. My dad quickly closed the window and wrapped a towel around my bleeding arm. After that, I developed a very bad infection and was put in the hospital for a couple of weeks. My dad went to the curandera that had saved my mother, and she gave him a poultice to spread on my wound. Immediately, it began to heal, and I was able to come back home. My dad told me that when he was a young man, he dated a girl from his village. But then he met my mother and fell in love with her. He married her, and his old girlfriend has haunted him ever since. She was the black dog that tried to kill my mother, and now she had tried to kill me as well. The bruja's protection spell was strong enough to keep the black dog from my mother, so that's why she came to me instead. But now that she had bitten me, my body started to change. I grew hair on my body and on my face. I started wanting to go out at night. I got it in my mind that if I found this woman and killed her, I would be free from this curse. I went to the neighboring village where my father was born and I found her. She just looked like a helpless old woman. So I waited till nightfall when she would go roaming in her dog body. I saw her leave her home and I followed her. She trotted right down the road to our village, several miles away. My father would never go out at night because he was afraid of her. But that night he found me missing from my bed, and so he went outside looking for me. I saw the black dog lunge at him and I jumped on her. We fought and I tore open her throat with my teeth. I was protecting my father. But I had my first taste of blood. Now I'm a grown man and I have killed many of my enemies. In my line of work, one cannot trust anyone. But I trust you, Jack. My housekeeper, Rosa, my sister, Juanita, are the only ones who know the truth about me, until now. I'm asking you to help me, to join me. Together we can stop the drug lords from taking this land from the Tarahumaras. Together we can fight the Juarez cartel and the Sinaloa cartel and the Zetas. They're all fighting against each other for this land. They are ruthless killers. They decapitate and mutilate their rivals and they dump them in public places to instill fear in the public and to the police. Well, now we will instill fear in them. We will be an army of wolves. Julian stood and walked over to Miguel's chair and put his hand on Miguel's shoulder. I will help you. I am a wanted man. I may never be able to return to Germany, but I am alive today because of you 4 people right here. I will help you fight. Jack looked over at Kat and sighed deeply, removing his cowboy hat. Look, there's a lot of things I don't understand. I don't know how deeply entrenched you are in this whole drug business. I don't know what kind of money laundering you do or what kind of criminal activities you've been a part of in your past or even right now. But I know I don't like what's happening with the trafficking of drugs into the U.S. And I know I don't like it when a peaceful community of people gets bullied into losing their land, their livelihood, their culture, and their lives. The idea of doing whatever I can to help take down the drug cartels is a noble pursuit, worthy of any man. But I sure as hell won't do it if you're just repositioning yourself to be the kingpin. Your agenda must be an honest one, or I don't want a part of it. I think you better tell us a little more about this line of work you're in, Miguel. Miguel looked down at his boots for a moment. Jack, you are an honorable man and you deserve to know the truth. I grew up on a ranch outside Ciudad Juarez. It is the epicenter of violence in Mexico. The violence in my city has given rise to all sorts of stories, and all of them are true. It is not uncommon to see a dog running in the street with a human bone in its mouth. We joke that in Juarez you throw your dog a human head instead of a ball. That is not far from the truth. It is very difficult to be an honest businessman and a rancher in Mexico. We have 7 major drug cartels and many drug gangs maneuvering for control. And they are continually forming allies and enemies with each other and with the government and the police officials. They all vary in sophistication and organization, but one thing you can be sure of is that the corruption is at all levels. The Sinaloa cartel has a special unit called Los Pilones, with recruited police officials and military deserters. So the Gulf cartel started the Los Zetas, with deserters from Mexico's airborne special forces groups. Now, these elite soldiers have the tactical skills, the intelligence gathering capability, marksmanship, and rapid deployment tactics of a highly organized military unit. The Zetas were formed in 1999, and now they are their own cartel fighting for control of the U.S.-Mexican border. And they pay their soldiers much more money to work for them than the government does. It's rare to find a police officer or a soldier that is not on the cartel's payroll. Murder is so common here that it is estimated that someone disappears every hour of every day. Honestly, I think that's an underestimate. Murdering people and hiding their bodies has become a kind of a national sport, if not an epidemic. They see no difference between killing men or killing deer or a mouse. I heard one man say that if he didn't kill someone every day, he felt he hadn't done his duty. Jack, you knew me back when I was a cocky young bull rider, full of grit, but fame comes at a price. You have no idea what it's like. Every day, your life is on the line. It was late October 2009, just before the Zetas' declaration of war against the Gulf Cartel. I was doing a little horse trading, investing in some quarter horses for racing. Horses have always been my passion. Well, I got lucky and I had a sweet little sorrel colt that had come from a top bloodline and was fast. In Mexico, quarter horse racing is an obsession steeped in northern Mexico's proud ranching heritage. Every cartel has its favorite jockeys, its favorite trainers, and horse agents. And owning the best bloodlines was a source of pride, and the drug lords were always trying to outshine each other on the track. Well, my little sorrel qualified for one of the most prestigious quarter horse races in America. That year he was set to race in the Dash for Cash Futurity in Texas, one of the most lucrative races of the season, with a $500,000 purse. Hell, the race is held every October at the Lone Star Park Racetrack in Grand Prairie, not that far from Dallas. I was approached by a horse agent who was buying up breeding stock and racehorses for the Zetas. With so much money on the line, they wanted my horse. They weren't about to let my horse win if they didn't own it. I knew the race was fixed. With so much money on the line, races are not left solely to fate or a horse's natural ability. Often a horse will be shocked with electrical volts from a handheld device so it'll run faster. That practice is called buzzing. It's illegal in the United States, but it's still used by some jockeys. They will test the horse beforehand to see what its reaction is. Does the horse spook and jump, or does it bolt? Will it cause them to have that extra surge of speed needed to win? Well, they wanted my horse, and if I didn't sell it to them, both me and my horse would be dead. It was easy for them to build a racing dynasty in the United States. Transactions were often in cash and sealed with nothing more than a handshake. They used horses to funnel their money through U.S. banks. They set up front companies in the U.S. to mask their involvement in the horse business. They would bid on valuable horses and put any name they wanted on the ownership documents. But the Zeta cartel wasn't sure he could trust his horse agent. They suspect that he had been padding his expenses, and they offered me the position. I had no choice but to take it, otherwise I would be killed. They offered me an outrageous sum of money. They told me that I'd never have to touch an ounce of cocaine, that I would never be expected to run drugs or be involved in the drug trade whatsoever. My business would be strictly legitimate, buying and selling horses for the cartel. I could have my ranch, breed the finest horse stock, and still rodeo and be a cowboy. It seemed like a dream come true at the time. In my opinion, there is nothing more Western than quarter horse racing. A lot of people want the thoroughbreds, but quarter horses are lightning fast sprinters. They're smart and they're agile. They can work all day herding cattle, then race on the weekends. In quarter horse racing, even an ordinary ranch horse and its owner has a chance at being a champion. Thoroughbred racing is for the elite, not quarter horse racing. Well, by January of the following year, my horse had already won 2 prestigious races, set a new speed record, and been awarded Racehorse of the Year at Heritage Place. In a very short period of time, I had developed a reputation as the horse breeder that was unmatched in quarter horse circles. Well, but then the FBI got involved. I was in way over my head at this point. I had one of the highest valued broodmares in the business. My name was spoken in all the horse racing circles. I was laundering millions of dollars a month for one of the most dangerous drug cartels in Mexico, and I had been set up as the fall guy. I was given a choice by the FBI. Either spend my life in a federal prison in the United States or give the FBI information they could use to bring down the operation. I was told that I would be given refuge in the U.S., a new identity, kept safe. Well, I know for a fact that isn't true. If you cross the Zetas, there was nowhere in the world you can hide. They will find you and they will kill you, and it would not be a pleasant way to die. I was stuck between a rock and a hard place. Somehow I had to outsmart both the FBI and the cartel if I was going to come out of this alive. Meanwhile, the war was intensifying. The Gulf Cartel had joined forces with the Sinaloa Cartel, their former competitor, to wipe out their greater enemy, the Zetas. Convoys of SUVs with heavily armed men in tactical gear were driving into small towns searching for Zetas to kill. My boss, the head of the cartel, summoned to his ranch a handful of men who were crucial to his American racing dynasty. He had a plan for expanding his empire north of the border, but he needed successful businessmen who could spend millions of dollars in the U.S. without raising any suspicion. I had been buying valuable racehorses and arranging races for several years now. We were running horses at the tracks under several different owners' names, usually listed as LLCs. All our horses had been renamed after expensive sports cars like Maserati, Bugatti, Porsche, which was unusual because most owners like to keep a horse's original name to show its pedigree. Well, since ours had been changed, it would be difficult to trace the original owners. It was easy to set up the LLCs, and the horses could be shuffled from one to the next quite easily, each time moving more of cartel's money through the U.S. banks. The All-American Futurity in the small mountain town of Ruidoso, New Mexico, was the next big race coming up. There would be a $2 million purse, the largest in its history. Anyone serious in the racing circles would be there. You might say the All-American is on the same scale as the Kentucky Derby, only for quarter horses. It was held every Labor Day, right after one of the biggest auctions of the year for yearlings that will be trained to race the following year. And some of the most valuable racing bloodlines the industry had to offer would be there, along with all the big players. Well, the 3-day weekend culminated in the All-American Futurity on Labor Day. Only 10 horses can qualify for this grueling 440-yard race. More than 400 horses compete for placement, and horses that were picked could claim to be some of the world's fastest. My horse was one of them. The world speed record had been set here during the 2006 race when a horse called No Secrets Here had demolished the 440 in less than 21 seconds, clocking a speed of 43 miles an hour. I didn't think my horse could beat that record, but I did think I had a good chance of winning the race. My horse was definitely not the long shot. Well, the Ruidoso Downs racetrack is in a small green valley with juniper scrub. It's surrounded by pine tree-covered mountains. On Labor Day, the stands overflowed with spectators for the race. Before the race began, the jockeys made a quick pass through the indoor betting area, crowded with gamblers and people lined up for drinks at the kiosks. Most of the spectators sitting in the stands were Mexican or Mexican-American. Down in the air-conditioned turf club and VIP boxes, many of the faces were white, but it was no secret that the future of U.S. quarter racing was Latino. However, as you will see in a moment, the industry is picking up major interest in Brazil and Portugal. The bugle player began playing the call to post, and the horses filed down the red dirt track towards the starting gate. The excitement in the crowd was palpable. Everyone cheered as the horses passed by, preparing to line up. Everyone was paying attention. You see, even though it is a 440-yard race, which is a quarter of a mile, these horses can cover that distance in less than half a minute. I heard the clap of the metal starting gate fly open and the horses' hooves hit the track, sounding like thunder. Suddenly, out of nowhere, there was a huge explosion. I heard screams, gunshots, more explosions. People were running, falling over each other in their hurry to exit the stands. I couldn't tell which direction the shots were coming from. There was smoke and everything was a blur. I felt someone grab me and a bag was thrown over my head, and I felt a gun pointing into my back, guiding me away. But people were pushing against me and I tripped over something or someone in the aisle. I fell. My head went down and I hit something hard, probably the edge of a bench. I felt something fall on top of me and a burning sensation in my side. Then everything went black. The next 24 hours were a blur. I woke up only to feel a hypodermic needle being shoved into my arm, and then everything went black again. I didn't know it at the time, but days had passed while I was in captivity, drugged and held hostage. When I did finally awake, I was sitting in a dark cement room, strapped to a chair with zip ties. My mouth was gagged and my head hung forward. Every part of my body hurt, and I realized that the strange taste in my mouth was probably blood. I was alone in the room. It hurt to move my head from side to side, to look at my surroundings. My eyes didn't seem to open very wide and appeared to be swollen shut. I knew I'd been beaten up pretty badly, even in my state of consciousness. As I was to learn later, it was not the FBI or the cartel that held me. I had been taken by the Brazilian underground mafia, and that was just the beginning of the story, Miguel said as he got up and stretched. Time for another bottle of tequila. He walked away to the hacienda, leaving everyone anxious to hear the rest of the story. This is part 10 of the Wolfman series, The Wolf's Dilemma. Giselle was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. I fell in love the moment she walked into the room. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Miguel poured another round of tequila and sat back in his chair by the campfire. He paused. He was lost in thought and memories. As I told you, I'd been drugged and I'd been beaten. I didn't know how many days had passed since I'd been taken from the race course or who'd taken me. I was thirsty and my body hurt from one end to the other. All I knew was that I was sitting in a dark cement room strapped to a chair with zip ties. My hands were behind my back, my mouth was gagged, my eyes were nearly swollen shut, and my ankles were bound to the chair. I tried to call out, but through the rag that bound my mouth, all I could manage was a small moaning sound. I did this several times. Finally, the door to the room burst open, and in walked the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, flanked by a rough man on either side of her, and through my swollen eyes, I thought I was seeing things. In fact, the thought passed through my mind that I had died, and this was the angel of mercy coming for me. He chuckled to himself, reflecting back on that moment. She stood in front of me, tall and dressed in skin-tight black clothing. Her dark hair hung over her shoulders, and I couldn't take my eyes off of her. She motioned for her guards to remove my gag, and she gave me a drink of water from a bottle. I sputtered and I choked, and she laughed. Then she slapped me right across the face. Then she turned and walked from the room, closing the doors behind her, leaving the two guards standing, one on either side of me. I expected more beatings, but they cut my ties, and they guided me from the room and down a long corridor to a courtyard. After hours in that dark room, the sun was just almost too much to bear, but I could see, sitting amidst the giant leaves and ferns, was that woman. I was led to a large wicker chair where she sat, and told to sit in a chair across from her. With a wave of her hand, they left the courtyard, leaving just the two of us alone. She told me her name was Giselle, and that she and her brother had rescued me from the cartel, that they had saved my life. I asked why they wanted me, who was her brother, and where the hell was I? She told me I was in Sao Paulo. She and her brother, Pablo, were horse breeders, and they held stakes in the Grand Prêmio Brazil, which takes place in Sao Paulo every year. I asked her what that had to do with me. Why couldn't they have just called me on the phone? Why the kidnapping? She explained that the Juarez cartel had gotten wind that I was working with the U.S. feds, and I was supposed to be executed immediately after the race, just as they were announcing the winners. The man in charge of the hit was friends with her brother, and together they arranged the kidnapping to save my life. They had roughed me up so it would look like the cartel thugs had done it. They photographed me, and they sent the photos to the cartel boss, letting him know that I'd been taken care of, and then they whisked me away to Brazil. Pablo was a key player in the Brazilian mafia, and rescuing me was a risk and an investment they were willing to take. I wasn't sure if I should feel relieved or not. If they had saved my life, what would I now have to do for them to repay them? Well, over the next several weeks, I was a guest on Giselle and Pablo's stud farm, about an hour outside of Sao Paulo. It spreads over about 430 hectares of beautiful rolling hills of green. The ranch is known for the beautiful Brazilian Lusitano horses, but the farm was now breeding quarter horses for racing stock. Giselle and her brother intended to breed the fastest horses using scientific methods and had already made quite a name for themselves on the circuit. And with my help and my horses, they felt certain they could develop the best and the fastest bloodlines. They'd already arranged to buy my breeding stock for a fortune. So what did they need me for? Apparently, it was my formula of choosing my breeding stock that they wanted from me. You see, horse breeding is a science. Traditionally, the main goal in selecting racehorses for breeding is monetary earnings. So horses that earn the highest amounts of money are the ones that are highly selected. Well, these animals are not always the fastest on the race course, however. My strategy has always been different. A combination of heritability, genetic correlation, and trends. My selection process occurs first by evaluating the horses that obtain the best times, and then secondly, by evaluating the highest monetary earnings, which is just the opposite of most breeders. I don't want to bore you with statistics, but it's important to know that the genetic origin of the quarter horse breed, it dates back to the 17th century when English mares were bred with stallions from the regions of present-day Saudi Arabia and Turkey. They were the great sprinters, and they've been used as racehorses since 1943 in the United States, but Brazil didn't begin racing them until 1978. Giselle didn't start her breeding program until like 20 years after that. To really develop a reputation as a breeder, you need to be producing top quarter horse stock for many, many years. And Portugal was a new market for her, and she wanted to position herself and her horses at the top. Portugal has really not had any major placement in horse racing until just recently. It was illegal to bet on horses, but that is now changing with the current government. And soon it will be just as popular there as it is in Brazil. So already the Portuguese are clamoring for Giselle's breeding stock. So to get on with my story, the whole reason for my capture was to prevent my death at the hands of the cartel and to use my knowledge of horse breeding and my reputation for breeding the fastest horses to boost their bloodlines. I quickly became partners with Giselle and Pablo in the horse business. Occasionally, Pablo's dark business dealings with the mafia would interfere with our operation. But for the most part, we were legit in our horse operation. I had grown facial hair, I wore contacts to make my eyes look green, and I was going under the name of Antonio Braga. I was Giselle's partner and no one questioned my identity. I quite easily slid under the cartel's radar. Life in Brazil was good for a time. Giselle was a ruthless businesswoman and she was smart. She was also torturous to a fault. One moment she'd be kind, then the next she'd fly into a rage and everyone in her path had to run for cover. But she had an animalistic sensuality that was unmatched by any creature I'd ever seen. And I don't use the word creature lightly. I told you I was a Nawal. But my powers were not strong until I learned to use them, and it was Giselle who taught me. She recognized the beast in me because she too was a shapeshifter. I didn't know it at first, but one dark night I awoke to find her missing. The window was open, and there was a slight breeze blowing through the sheer curtains. I got up to close the windows and saw in the moonlight a large black cat slinking through the courtyard. It looked like a jaguar. I watched it leap over the courtyard wall and run off into the night. I looked all over the house. I could not find Giselle anywhere. The next morning, she was asleep in my bed. I began to notice more of these events. I would awaken to find her missing, and always the window would be open. I often saw the cat. I would mention it to her, and she would just smile at me and shrug it off as not being important enough to discuss. So one night, just after she had left, I walked out into the courtyard and waited for hours. And just before dawn, the huge black jaguar jumped over the wall into the courtyard. I was sitting on a bench waiting. I stood and I confronted the cat. It snarled at me, but I didn't move. Suddenly, the cat sprang towards me, and with a mighty sweep of her front paw, she scraped my chest with her claw.
The terror and the excitement brought out the beast in me, and I transformed into my wolf form. We fought, and though we were quite capable of killing the other, we didn't. It was more play than actual fight. After that night, we often hunted together. What a sight we must have been. A huge black jaguar stalking through the night together with a large black wolf dog. Giselle was the love of my life. But with such happiness, there's bound to be sorrow. In the next few years, we became known as the top breeders of Brazil's fastest horses. We could ask any price we wanted. Then one night, members of the PCC stormed our house. We had guards stationed all around the ranch, but it's a big piece of property, and their snipers killed several of our guards, breaking through our defenses. And by the time the cameras picked up the raid, we were surrounded. Well, it is anger that brings out the beast in me, and I was mad. I raced out into the courtyard surrounding our hacienda, and all they saw was a big black dog coming at them. I was shot at several times, but the bullets flew right past me. I tore into the nearest gunman, ripping out his throat, and quickly moved on to the next. A bullet pierced my left thigh, but it didn't bring me down. I thought I saw a huge jaguar on top of one of the gunmen, so I know Giselle was fighting there beside me. Someone threw a grenade into the hacienda, and I heard explosions. There was gunfire everywhere. And when the smoke finally cleared, the carnage was immense. All but one of our guards had been shot, and many of the PCC were dead, either shot by our soldiers or gored by Giselle and myself. I looked around for Giselle, but she was gone. I waited all night. When she finally arrived home, I saw that she was badly injured. She was having trouble transforming back into her human self. I got into the car and we drove away, leaving Pablo to clean up the mess. Where do you take an injured wildcat? Surely not to a hospital. Our horse vet was always on call for us night or day, and I felt I could trust him. He would need to be notified of the raid anyway, so we could see if any of our horses had been injured. I drove to his ranch. It's about 12 miles away. He met us at the gate, and we rushed Giselle into the medical clinic at the ranch. She had bullets in her thigh, her neck, and lodged near her spine. She had lost a lot of blood and was just clinging to life. He gave her a sedative and began to remove the bullets. It took several hours, but she finally transformed, and under the blankets tucked around her was the form of a woman rather than a cat. Her beautiful face looked up at me and smiled. Then she closed her eyes and she drew her last breath. Well, I was devastated. I cannot describe to you the pain and suffering I went through. The next year was just a blur to me, but at some point I left Brazil and traveled back here to Mexico. I didn't care if I lived or I died. Juanita took me in and cared for me just like she is doing here for Julian. I sold all but a few of my horses, and you pretty much know the rest of the story. These days I am keeping a low profile. For the last few years I've bought and I've sold Criollo cattle to ranches and packing plants in the United States, and it is a legitimate business. But now I am helping my friend Osa fight to keep the Criollo cattle safe from the drug lords and the cartel that want the land. They don't care about the livestock. They only care about the crops they can plant in the rich soil of the Sierra Madre. And there you have it. That is my story. It has been fraught with danger, and I keep a close watch on my back at all times. Many years have passed, and people have forgotten my name, and I like it that way. But as I said, it is difficult to be an honest businessman in Mexico. With that, Miguel stood and yawned. Good night, amigos. Tomorrow we leave for La Aduana for the annual fiesta of the Virgin of Balvanera. There we will meet Osa and give him your decision. Well, Rosa had breakfast ready and had packed several meals to take with them on the trip to La Aduana. They were looking at a 9-hour drive. If there were no military roadblocks or police barricades, they'd be able to do it. Is this really necessary? Jack wondered aloud. Miguel's story had kept him awake all night long. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to return to Montana, just forget this whole mess he was in, and he still had to decide what to do about returning to Germany, meeting with Luther for a cure, and what he should do with Julian. He was tired, he was grumpy. But Kat seemed to be excited to attend this festival. She had researched it and was eager to attend. He'd do it for her, but he wasn't sure what his answer would be once he had to face the Tarahumara Indian named Osa. Did he really want to get involved in their war against the cartels? Every part of his being told him no. It just wasn't his battle. On the drive to La Aduana, Kat explained what she'd read on the internet. In 1683, the Mayo Indians outside Alamos saw a virgin perched atop a tall, prickly cactus. She was wearing white robes and a blue shawl, which was just how they knew she was a virgin. They piled rocks up against the cactus so that she could step down, but instead, she flew away. They followed her a short distance away. They found a rich vein of silver in the earth. A mining town sprang up on that spot, and it was called La Aduana, and a church was built on the site where the Virgin first appeared. And every year in November, people come from all over Sonora, Sinaloa, and Chihuahua to celebrate her annual fiesta. Many will walk or crawl on their hands and knees to ask the Virgin for her blessing or to show adoration and gratitude for blessings she has bestowed on them from their previous pilgrimage. Well, Jack wasn't so sure it was going to be quite the festival Kat was expecting. He had read about it also, and he knew that each year this small abandoned mining town sees tens of thousands of pilgrims. It only has 15 buildings still standing, no toilet facilities, and no trash collection. It's really just a big drunken party that combines a solemn religious festival with a flea market. Vendors sell everything from clothing to pots and pans, baseball hats to AK-47s. Food would be abundant as well as the beer. It sounded like the last place on earth Jack wanted to be. He did not have a good feeling about this at all. When they arrived, the village was a noisy, chaotic festival with hordes of people. Music blared from every corner, mixed with the yelling of the street vendors and the smells of the food stands. Paper plates and beer cans littered the streets. Men sliced off slivers of cheek meat from roasting cow heads and ladled out bowls of goat stew and menudo. Thin sheets of marinated steak sizzled over charcoal fires. Everywhere were crowds packed with Mexicans, Yaqui, and the Mayo Indians. A few scattered Tarahumara Indians. There were cowboys, peasant farmers, well-dressed young men and women. There were cattle ranchers riding their horses through the streets. There were tourists, drug dealers, and narcos. They were the most distinguishable with their gold jewelry and expensive cowboy boots. Miguel felt right at home amidst this sea of humanity, greeting old friends and introducing his guests to everyone. At the far end of the village, they found Osa sitting by himself, leaning against a rock, waiting for them. He had traveled to La Aduana by foot, which meant he had walked nearly 100 miles across some of the most rugged country on earth. It had taken him 3 days, and he had drunk from the streams and rivers and eaten nothing but a little of the toasted ground corn called pinole along the way. When asked why he traveled so far to come here, he replied in his native tongue, with Miguel translating, "I come to ask the Virgin for her blessing that Miguel's friend will stay and help my people." What a setup, Jack thought to himself. How do you deny a man who has just walked over 100 miles to ask some virgin saint for her assistance in granting his prayers? They walked together over to the church. The silver mine had long since run dry, so the miners had drifted away from the village. They abandoned it once it stopped producing, but then the famous cactus had started growing out of the vertical stone wall of the church, apparently nourished by nothing but stone, mortar, air, and rain. Its roots are about 8 feet off the ground, tethered somehow into a chink of mortar. It grows up into a tall column with several arms, and its shadow is said to look like the Virgin Mary. All around the church were groups of musicians with trumpets, guitars, accordions, and saxophones, all of them playing different songs at the same time, trying to drown out each other's music. It was painful to listen to, yet all around the base of the church, Mayo Indian families slept peacefully on checkered acrylic blankets. Upon entering the church, the music faded, and so did the light. At the nave of the church, surrounded by the warm glow of candles, was a tiny doll-like figure, not more than a foot high. It was in a glass box. Her face was white, and in her arms she held a baby. People filed past one at a time, touched the glass with their fingertips. They crossed themselves, and they dropped coins into an old wooden box. Jack filed into line behind his companions, and they watched as each person in front of them followed that routine. Finally, it was Miguel's turn, and he stepped up, looked up to heaven, and kissed his fingertips, blowing a kiss to the heavens. Then he touched the glass and crossed himself. Next followed Juanita, Julian, Kat, and Osa. As Osa approached the virgin encased in glass, he turned and he looked at Jack, muttered something under his breath, and he drew the cross over Jack, then turned and followed the routine in the same manner as every other person. Jack stepped up to the effigy encased in glass. He touched his fingers to the small glass box, and in that split second, a jolt of electricity ran through his body. His eyes closed involuntarily, and a vision flashed through his mind. He saw a wolf running through the forest, chased by men with AK-47s. They were closing in on him. Suddenly, he was flanked on either side by runners. Tarahumara Indians were running beside him, but instead of their customary headdress and dark hair and Indian features, their heads looked more like spotted leopards. They ran to the edge of a canyon that dropped off into a deep abyss, then abruptly darted behind the bushes at the cliff's edge, hidden from sight. The men running after them were firing their guns and didn't see the edge of the cliff behind low shrub bushes until it was too late. As they teetered on the edge of the cliff, trying to gain their balance, the rock ledge gave way and the men fell. The vision changed, and Jack now saw a whole band of warriors with the bodies of men and the facial features and spots of a leopard standing next to several large black wolves. Jack quickly drew his hand away from the glass. The vision faded as quickly as it had come. He looked up with the wide eyes at his friends, but they were already moving ahead and out of the church. Everyone except old Osa, who had turned and was staring at Jack with his piercing gaze. Jack looked at him straight in the eyes, nodded his head. Yes.